criterion of death? Well, it's a measurable condition, they want to say. It's useful for guiding death statutes and practical decision making. So, what are the choices here? Well, in published works, 4 ones are big for a criterion of death. Each has been accepted by some group of scholars. First one's the whole brain, second one's the higher brain, third one's the brain stem, and the fourth one would be the circulatory formulation. The whole brain one is necessary for death because the operations of the functions of the organism as a whole are distributed throughout the brain. So here Bernat is getting into defending his own view about the whole brain criterion being the best one. The irreversible cessation of brain functions, he says, serves as a criterion of death because it is a necessary and sufficient condition for the cessation of the organism as a whole. What about a brain-dead patient? Bernat actually says the brain-dead patient is a mechanically supported living component part of a human organism. The human organism, however, has already died. Okay, opponents of this view include Alan Schumann and his followers. They reject any type of brain criterion of death because they regard the brain as only one bodily organ that has no greater significance in a concept of death than any other organ. Schumann's most recent look at this concept of death distinguishes 2 stages of death. One of them involves passing away, focused upon the permanent cessation of the organism as a whole, and the next one involves deanimation, which he views as focused on the irreversible cessation of the organism as a whole. Notice the difference between permanent cessation and irreversible cessation. Bernat says, I agree with Schumann that the distinction between permanent and irreversible cessation of function is critical in an analysis of death. The only case in which the difference between using a permanent or an irreversible standard in death determination becomes consequential is that of organ donation after circulatory death, or DCD. He talks about why that's the case. He also notes that there is an asymmetry in using permanent or using irreversible cessation of functions that comes when physicians determine death with brain tests or with circulatory respiratory tests. So in conclusion, he asks, is it possible that these disagreements can be resolved in the future given the fact that they've persisted for the past 4 decades? Well, he's got bad news and good news. Bad news is the only means of achieving consensus is for scholars to accept the paradigm conditions for a death analysis. Okay? But it can be done. So that's why he's the yes article, right? He's saying this can be done. It's bad news is that you've got to do it, but it can be done. Some more good news is that it probably doesn't really matter whether scholarly consensus can be achieved because the practical issues on the ground have now largely settled themselves out for a stable consensus. On a practical level, even the alternative author is correct that society can accept and successfully implement the whole brain criterion of death without first agreeing on a definition of death. But it is a good idea to try to have a definition of death, a conceptually satisfying way of justifying our current practices.